Hello. There was a time when Games Workshop was all set to bring together some of the best writers and artists in British comics to produce an anthology of stories set in the worlds of Warhammer Fantasy and 40k. But this wasn't before the launch of Black Library, Inferno Magazine and Warhammer Monthly in the 90s. This was the better part of a decade earlier in the late 80s. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're exploring the history of the Warhammer comic that never was. In what you might call Games Workshop's second age, that time after the creation of Warhammer Fantasy, but before it and its sci-fi sibling had become the beating heart of the company, Games Workshop was an organisation that was exploring brand new ways to tell stories, play games, and just live in its fantasy worlds. There were a lot of experiments from that era. Some of them have survived to today. Blood Bowl, even 40k. You can still read stories about Genevieve the Vampire and Jack Draco the Inquisitor. And, of course, if you can handle it, you can still listen to D-Rock on Spotify. Actually, I just checked, and Spotify can't handle D-Rock, so you'll have to content yourself with Bolt Thrower instead. Alas, some of those experiments did not stand the test of time, or in some cases, even make it to print. Long before the launch of the Inferno Magazine or Warhammer Monthly, there had been rumblings of a Warhammer comic, one that sounded like it could have been incredible. But before we get into that, why don't you smash the like button, snick to the subscribe button, and bamf this video by sharing it with your friends. And yes, I regret everything I just said. In 1997, Games Workshop's self-described minister without portfolio, Andy Jones, the man who designed Warhammer Quest, invented the Troll games, and managed Warhammer Records, was finally able to set up the Black Library, a publishing arm for Workshop that would take control of the commissioning and publication of new books set in the worlds of Warhammer. Their first project was Inferno, a short fiction anthology that would also include some comic strips, featuring 40k and fantasy stories. Within a year, the series had proven popular enough to warrant the creation of a dedicated comic anthology, Warhammer Monthly, which would feature strips from some of GW's best writers and artists. But as I say, Warhammer Monthly was not the first attempt at an anthology comic for Games Workshop, and in fact, was not the first comic strip that they published either, not by a long shot. As early as 1977's White Dwarf issue 1, Games Workshop began publishing comics in some form, with a brief strip called The Keeper of the Flame that was credited to Taupe. I don't know for sure who this may be, but Albi Fiore, who would later design Citadel's logo and manage the publication of GW's first range of board games, would go on to become a crossword setter for the Guardian newspaper, and the pseudonym he used was Taupe. So it may well be that Fiore created this original comic strip. Issue 5 of White Dwarf saw the first appearance of a more traditional comic, writer and artist David Lloyd's Calgar, described as a sword and sorcery hero. Calgar lived in the medieval land of Arquetta, a place previously cursed with years of civil war, but now blessed with peace. Though it is a peace that this discontented wanderer and ex-soldier cannot find a home in. Calgar ran for 3 issues of White Dwarf with full-page spreads, before being cut to only a half-page for the 4th part of the story. Then, in issue 9 of White Dwarf, there was another half-page strip, but this one appears to be the last appearance of the sword and sorcery hero, and it's actually revealed that he lives in a sci-fi future, undergoing some sort of medical procedure that uses a fantasy adventure in his mind to help him process his feelings. I wonder if Assassin's Creed used to read White Dwarf. Despite the sudden left turn of the Calgar comic, David Lloyd would go on to far greater things, not least of which was illustrating Alan Moore's V for Vendetta. Whether out of respect for or confusion from the end of Calgar, it would be a while before White Dwarf would attempt publishing comic strips again. Issue 45 in September 1983 would usher in a new age of GW comics, with the premiere of 2 new titles, Mark Harrison's science fiction story The Travelers, and Carl Critchlow's Thrud the Barbarian. The Travelers was a parody of a Traveller RPG campaign, which ran until June 1986's White Dwarf 78. The original printing of the Travelers in White Dwarf was in black and white, but Harrison has since uploaded coloured versions of the strips to a dedicated website, which I've linked in the description below. Harrison would go on to work on many 2000 AD comics, in particular Durham Red with writer Dan Abnett. We'll come back to Thrud in a moment, but Martha has just reminded me that this is probably the best time to mention two unusual, strange, little characters that regularly appeared in White Dwarf, at least for a while. One was Derek the Troll, and the other was the goblinoid creature known as Gobbledygook. Gobbledygook was created by Bill Sedgwick, an artist who worked on GW games like Fury of Dracula and Space Marine. The Gobbledygook strips were busy and quite dense, packed with fantasy tropes and objectionable behaviour from the goblinoid in question. Snipe and Wib have made a terrific breakdown of the Gobbledygook series, which I have linked to in the description below. Derek the Troll, meanwhile, first appeared in Games Workshop's other magazine, Warlock, in 1986. Warlock was created as a dedicated magazine for fighting fantasy gamebooks, originally published by Penguin. It seemingly became apparent that a wider brief was required for the magazine though, and by issue 6, Games Workshop took over publication to cover the entire gamebook market. There had been some earlier comic strips in the pages of Warlock, but in issue 10, they debuted Lou Stringer's Derek the Troll, an affable but stinky troll, or perhaps a prehistoric human of some kind? Either way, with Warlock ending after 13 issues, Derek jumped over to White Dwarf, but within 5 issues seems to have made a fair few enemies of his reading public, before disappearing from the GW limelight for good. So back to that mightily muscled but small-headed Thrud the Barbarian. The reaction that he got from the public was quite the opposite of Derek the Troll. People loved Thrud. Thrud is a parody of Conan that draws on the works of Frank Frazetta, and it was created by Critchlow when he was just 18 years old and still in art college. His tutor, the tremendously successful Brian Talbot, challenged Critchlow to create a comic strip as a project for college, and because he was reading Robert E. Howard's Conan at the time, Critchlow felt inspired. After initially publishing in independent zines, Thrud's appearance in White Dwarf led to a long and much-loved run. For 3 years in a row, Thrud was voted as the most popular feature in the magazine in the annual reader survey, and in 1987, Games Workshop took the unusual step of publishing a dedicated Thrud comic, Thrud the Barbarian graphic novel. Although primarily a fantasy parody featuring plenty of trappings of traditional fantasy stories, as well as an arch-enemy called Black Current, Thrud also found time to pay homage to everything from Judge Dredd to Games Workshop's post-apocalyptic Dark Future game. Critchlow has since gone on to work extensively in the comics and tabletop industry, with credits including Dungeons & Dragons, Magic the Gathering, 2000 AD, and Judge Dredd. And he has even revisited Thrud many times in his career, including to provide the basis for miniatures that were made both by Citadel and later by other companies like CMON as well. The final Thrud strip in the original run came in September 1988's White Dwarf 105, though that was not supposed to be his final Games Workshop appearance. In fact, he was intended to be part of the ongoing anthology comic book, Warhammer Comics. Now, between the arrival of Thrud and the announcement of the Warhammer Comics project, there had actually already been at least one attempt to set an entire comic book story in the world of Warhammer Fantasy. That was the Quest of Caleb Dark. Appearing in the third Citadel Compendium in 1985, the first 10-page Caleb Dark story sets the stage for an epic adventure. It follows this somewhat Elric-inspired doomed Chaos warrior who fights against the followers of Khorne in defense of Prague in the Grand Duchy of Kislev. You see, he is both a follower of Chaos and a fighter of Chaos, because he doesn't follow the regular 4 Chaos gods that we know today. He actually worships the renegade god Malal. Caleb Dark was created by Judge Dredd legends John Wagner and Alan Grant, with art by Brett Ewins and Jim McCarthy. It had just 3 issues, but it is a fascinating moment in history where things could have gone quite different for Chaos and for the Warhammer world in general. And because I think it is such an interesting story, I'll be trying to find time to make a video all about it at some point. First mention of the Warhammer comic anthology came in the Culture Shock news page of White Dwarf 103 in July 1988. Why are GW so popular? Think of the speeding metal of Dark Future, the grim peril of Woofrup, the ironically colourful 41st Millennium of Warhammer 40,000, the parody of Blood Bowl. Ironically colourful 41st Millennium. The past really is a foreign country. The trouble with a whole universe is the difficulty in getting it all into print. There's always another aspect to it that we don't have room to show you. Surely, plenty of people would be interested if we found a way of revealing a little more of the strange places, people, and creatures that exist in the games. Yes, but how? We're going to produce a high-profile monthly adventure comic. The news feature goes on to detail a 48-page comic that has had months of planning, conversations with famous names, and that will stay faithful to the background and worlds that the stories are adapting. What it doesn't do is provide a launch date though. Instead, it just signs off with "Watch this space." By White Dwarf 109 in January 1989, things had progressed, even if only slightly. There was now an editor attached to the project, Ian Rimmer, and a likely publication window the following spring. Rimmer had already had an impressive career in British comic books, having worked at IPC, the publishers behind 2000 AD and Judge Dredd, working on the horror comic Scream, and editing the likes of Spider-Man and Captain Britain for Marvel UK. Rimmer had also written for Judge Dredd and would go on to write comic stories for Zorro, the Hulk, and Real Ghostbusters. In White Dwarf 114, things get tantalizingly close. Not only is there a news item proclaiming the imminent release of the Warhammer comic, but there is also completed art pages shared as well, though they are painfully small. This summer, we will be launching Warhammer, a new monthly comic with strips drawn by some of the best artists in the world. Among the characters featured in the first few issues are Sigmar Heldenhammer, the fantasy hero whose epic war against the orcs and goblins created the Empire of the Old World, and Captain Black, a commander of the Dark Angels Space Marines. The tiny previews in the issue don't provide much visual information, but it does seem like there is a hive world that may be visible, as well as the Warhammer Galmaraz held aloft. The White Dwarf news item continued, "There will be some familiar faces too, such as Red Harvest, known to players of Dark Future as one of America's foremost ops. And, by popular demand, Thrud will be back, wreaking havoc in his own inimitable style and drinking the Hobbit's armpit dry." The Hobbit's armpit was a tavern, in case you were wondering, and Red Harvest, well, she was a character from the Dark Future game. She even received a very cool in-universe interview in White Dwarf 104. Although it's not mentioned in the news article, the preview pages of the comic are accompanied by a Pete Nifton illustration of the Chainsaw Warrior. CW, as he was often known, was the protagonist of the 1987 solo board game that lets players get absolutely destroyed by mutant rats and zombies in a post-apocalyptic race against time. The game actually includes a Chainsaw Warrior comic by Brett Ewins, but it seems that a new story would be included in the Warhammer comic, illustrated by the GW stalwart Nifton, who was responsible for art across many Games Workshop games. The blog Robeast's House of Magical Sunshine features another Nifton illustration of the Chainsaw Warrior, along with a 7-page script for an unpublished Chainsaw Warrior story that was written by Ian Rimmer, the editor who had been brought on to work on the anthology for Games Workshop. The particular iteration of the Warhammer comic that these news articles detail never actually made it to print, unfortunately. It seemed to peter out and then kind of disappear. But it wasn't quite dead, at least not yet. And in fact, some of the art that may have been intended for these comic strips possibly made it out into the public as well. White Dwarf 121 included John Blanche's semi-regular Illuminations feature, where he would curate and introduce art from an up-and-coming Games Workshop artist. In this issue, the artist in question was Kevin Walker. Included in the feature is a double-page spread that seems to show comic strip art, sans dialogue, of a Space Marine captain. On his shoulder is the name Black, potentially indicating that this art may have originally been intended for the comic story about Captain Black of the Dark Angel Space Marines. Interestingly enough, in the intro to this feature, Kev Walker says that his ambition is to publish a collection of work and a serious comic strip. And it also seems that some of the art created for the Warhammer Fantasy strip about Sigmar may also have found its way out as well. In the programme for the 1989 UK Comic Art Convention, there is a piece by artist John Ridgway entitled Sigmar Heldenhammer, with the copyright for Games Workshop detailed at the bottom. In fact, in the previous year's programme, there was another Ridgway piece which, whilst not bearing a title or GW copyright mark, very well could have been another image for this same story. With that version of the Warhammer comic seemingly stalled and nowhere to be seen by its intended spring 1990 release date, it would have been reasonable to expect that that was the end of the story, at least until issue 128 of White Dwarf brought it up again. Ian Abinet and Alan Cowsill have just joined the design studio as editors for the Warhammer comic, which is now proceeding apace. Ian and Alan have published their own comic, Stormwatcher, and have written strips for Revolver and Starblazer. They currently write the Ricky Kilcane strip for Deadline. There was also a note in the following issue that said that Ian and Alan would be attending the 1990 UK Comic Art Convention, with the intention of recruiting new artists and writers to work on the project. Presumably, some of the talent who had been recruited for the original version had since moved on. I reached out to Alan Cowsill to get his recollections about working on the project, and I started by asking if this was the same version of the anthology that Ian Rimmer had been working on. No, we were slightly after that and mostly started from scratch. John Ridgway's Sigmar was going to be in it. It was real classic high fantasy. The comic we were putting together, at least from my point of view, was trying to create something as exciting as Warrior had been back in the day. It would have been a magazine format too. Warrior was a science fiction and fantasy anthology comic published between 1982 and 1985 that featured a range of stories and talent. It was, in fact, where Alan Moore wrote and the post-Calgar David Lloyd illustrated the original V for Vendetta issues, which were then later picked up by DC Comics after the Warrior magazine ended its run. Sadly, it became apparent that this version of the Warhammer comic would also fail to make its way to the printing press, despite an incredible lineup of writers and artists that were being assembled behind the scenes. Middle management had a stranglehold over the creative process. I was part of Andy Jones's team, and his whole purpose was kind of an outlier at the time, coming up with amazingly creative products to expand the GW universe. Andy was trying to set up the albums at the time, for instance, as well as watching over the comic and the new book line. He was one of the best bosses I've had in publishing, and really stuck his head out for us all in his team. One of the things that makes me feel sad is just how good the lineup was going to be. We had Colin McNeil working on an Orc strip with his brother Roddy, Bill King and Kev Walker creating a Gotrek script. It would have been one of Kev's first strips at a time when he'd just done his first Rogue Trooper strip for 2000 AD. Andrew Curry adapting Deathwing with myself, while Simon Colby was working on a Space Hulk story. Carl Critchlow created some new Thrud stories with Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning. Colin McNeil, Andrew Curry, Simon Colby, and Andrew Lanning have all had top-flight careers in comics, with a raft of credits at 2000 AD, DC, Marvel, IDW, and many more between them. And it's a real shame that we didn't get to see what they might have created for the 40k and Warhammer Fantasy universes. And that's not to mention probably the biggest could have been of the whole thing. A Bill King scripted and Kevin Walker illustrated Gotrek and Felix comic was in the works in 1990. And much like John Ridgway's Sigmar art, a piece from the strip was also published in the UK Comic Art Convention programme. What an absolute beauty. Sadly, this was largely the end of the Warhammer Comics project in this form. There were no more mentions in White Dwarf news sections, no more comic art programs, at least not that I've been able to find. There's no public explanation for why work on the comics stopped, but it's probably no coincidence that the project ended around the same time as the 1991 management buyout of the company. Other ambitious ideas, like the self-published GW Books line, underwent massive changes then too, the likely result of reallocated investment budgets now better spent on international retail expansion and servicing corporate debt. On the comic's eventual fate, Alan Cowsill said, "Unfortunately, I think a lot of the top creators we brought into the company got disenchanted with the delays and changes, and went on to get work elsewhere." There would, of course, later be comics set in the 40k and Warhammer Fantasy universes, and though the lineage doesn't appear to be direct, there are a couple of interesting echoes from the earlier projects into the more recent ones. Simon Colby would later work on a 40k comic with a script by Dan Abnett called The Bridge, which appeared in the Flames of Damnation anthology in 2005. In the same collection, Andy Jones would also go on to tackle the story of Two Heads Talking, the character from Bill King and Brian Ansell's Deathwing short story, with art by David Pugh. That Flames of Damnation release also included a number of comics that were originally published in earlier collections. Amongst those, Colin McNeil provided art for 2 stories written by Gordon Rennie, one about a Genestealer cult overrunning an Adeptus Arbites headquarters, and the other about a Space Hulk graveyard. Of course, I have no way to know if those later stories did contain elements or themes or concepts or actual complete stories from the versions that may have been told in the earlier Warhammer comic, but it's interesting to consider. In the book Talking Miniatures, Andy Jones speaks about the challenges that were inherent in creating and maintaining what would ultimately be Games Workshop's most successful attempt at comic book publishing, the 86-issue run of Warhammer Monthly. Although that 1998 project was very different from the earlier failed attempts, it is conceivable that what Jones reflects on holds true for all of the various iterations of the comic. I was a strong proponent of it being US comic sized, in full colour, and with one story throughout. That's what comics were and are. But there were other senior voices who argued that it needed to be like The Victor or The Valiant. These were British comics from the mid-60s that featured characters like Alf Tupper, Captain Hurricane, and Roy of the Rovers. It had to be in black and white, and no story could be more than 2 pages long. In the end, those voices prevailed, and we ended up with something that was neither fish nor fowl. It was American comic-sized, not in colour, and with a range of characters and stories in each issue. I learned that compromise will kill both creativity and commerciality. If a project is going to succeed, it needs a diamond-hard vision and a champion who can make it happen. I was that champion. I was a good Games Workshop soldier, but I believed the vision was flawed. Then again, maybe I'm being a bit too harsh. Many people loved that comic, and I am still very proud of the fact that it launched the careers of many young writers and illustrators, so it was not all bad. Andy Jones, of course, was running the team when Ian Abnett and Alan Cowsill joined in order to edit their version of the Warhammer comic, and presumably was also running the same team when Ian Rimmer earlier was brought in to edit a different version of that comic. I think it's incredible that Andy Jones ultimately was, a decade later, able to get any kind of anthology comic released by Games Workshop, and it was clearly an incredible undertaking that was super hard to get done. I think it's a shame that we never saw those earlier versions, those earlier stories, because some of the talent involved is incredible. And yet, as Andy Jones says, it certainly didn't end up all that bad. We did get Warhammer Monthly. We got a comic set in the Warhammer Fantasy and 40k universes. We get to explore it in a different way and see different types of stories realized for us in incredible and interesting and immersive versions of these worlds. So, as a big comic fan and a big Warhammer fan, I'm grateful that even if some of what we might have seen didn't come to pass, at least something did. And it was fun along the way. You can read my entire interview with Alan Cowsill on my website. I've linked it in the description below. Thank you, Alan, for taking the time to answer my questions. And if you want to support the work that I do here on the channel, then why not check out my Patreon, my Ko-fi, or my Discord. They are all linked down below as well. And to my friend Matt, who has long waited for this particular video to come out on the channel, I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you all for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Ink for the ink god. That's what it should be.